My son looked me in the eye, in front of my own grandchildren, and said the word burden. He didn't whisper it. He didn't soften it. He just said it. The way you'd mentioned the weather. I smiled and nodded like it didn't touch me. 3 days later, his phone rang at 11 at night, and the only person who could save everything he'd built was standing in his kitchen holding a cup of coffee he hadn't asked for. Me. This isn't a story about revenge. I never wanted that. It's a story about what happens when a man spends his whole life quietly holding a family together, and nobody notices until the day the holding stops. My name is Robert Turner. Everybody calls me Bob. I'm 74 years old, and for 41 years I made my living as a master electrician in a small town outside Columbus, Ohio called Grove City. I built Turner Electric with my own 2 hands. Started it in a rented garage the year my son David was born, with 1 truck, 1 ladder, and a wife named Carol who believed in me more than I believed in myself. Carol passed 6 years ago. Ovarian cancer. I still make coffee for 2 most mornings before I catch myself. David is 44 now. Married to a good woman named Jennifer. 2 kids, Tyler, who's 12, and Grace, who just turned 9. David took over Turner Electric 8 years ago, right around the time his mother got sick. I handed him the keys to the truck, to the client list I'd built over 3 decades, and 30 years of relationships with contractors and inspectors all over Franklin County. I didn't hand it over because I was tired of the work. I handed it over because I wanted my son to have something that was already standing on solid ground. Most men don't get that. Most men build their whole life from nothing. David got to start from something. I never once let him feel that as a debt. I never once said, I gave you this. I just wanted him to have it. For the first few years, things were good between us. He'd call me with questions. Panel upgrades, permit trouble, a tricky commercial job. I'd drive over, walk the site with him, point at something, and leave before lunch. He'd buy me a coffee sometimes. That was enough for me. Then, slowly, something started to shift. I noticed it first at a job site about 2 years ago. A strip mall renovation out on Stringtown Road. I'd stopped by because David mentioned trouble with a sub-panel, and I figured I'd take a look before he called an inspector out for nothing. I was standing there in my work boots, looking at the wiring, when I heard one of his younger guys ask, "Who's the old timer?" David laughed it off. "That's just my dad. He used to run this place." Used to. I didn't say anything. I finished looking at the panel, told him what I saw, and drove home. But something about the way he said it stayed with me the whole ride back. Like I was a photograph on the wall. Something from before, not something still standing in the room. After that, the calls got fewer. When I did show up at a site, unannounced, just checking in the way I always had, I started catching looks. Not from the crew, they liked me fine. From David, a tightness around his jaw. A glance at his watch. I told myself I was imagining it. Grief does strange things to a man's sense of himself. I told myself David was just busy, that running a business in your 40s with 2 kids and a mortgage was harder than I remembered, and I should give him room. I gave him room. I gave him so much room, I almost disappeared from his life entirely without either one of us admitting it out loud. But I want you to understand something before I go any further. I never stopped loving my son. Not for 1 single second. Whatever happened next, whatever he said to me, whatever came after, none of it changed that. A father's love doesn't work like a light switch. It doesn't turn off just because it stops being returned. It just gets quieter. Sunday dinners had been a tradition in our family since before Carol got sick. Every week, rain or shine, the whole family gathered at David and Jennifer's place. Pot roast most weeks. Grace would help set the table. Tyler would show me whatever video game he was obsessed with that month, and I'd pretend to understand it. And he'd laugh at me, and that laugh was worth more to me than anything. I looked forward to those Sundays the way a man looks forward to Christmas morning. It was the one guaranteed hour of the week where I felt like I still belonged somewhere. 3 weeks ago, I noticed David seemed different the moment I walked in. Tighter, distracted. He barely looked up from his phone during dinner. Jennifer kept glancing at him with a worry I recognized. The look of a wife watching her husband carry something he wasn't sharing. I didn't ask. That's not how David and I talk to each other. Not anymore. We talked about weather and football and Tyler's grades. We didn't talk about what was actually happening underneath. After dinner, I did what I always did. I walked out to the garage with him while he grabbed something from his truck, just to get a few minutes alone with my son. Everything all right at the shop? I asked. He didn't answer right away. He was digging through a toolbox, more aggressively than the task required. It's fine, Dad. You seem stressed. I'm always stressed. That's the job. I nodded. I should have left it there. But something in me, maybe the part of me that spent 41 years fixing things, wanted to help. You know, if you ever want a second set of eyes on something, paperwork, a bid, whatever it is, I've got the time. David straightened up, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, he actually looked at me. Really looked at me. Not with warmth, with something closer to exhaustion. Dad, I don't need you checking my paperwork. I didn't mean it like, I know what you meant. His voice had an edge now, sharp enough that I actually took a step back. You mean it like you always mean it. Like the business is still yours. Like I'm still some kid running around with your tools. That's not fair, David. You want to know what's not fair? He set the toolbox down harder than he needed to. Having my own guys ask if my father's coming to check up on me. Having clients call you instead of me because they remember the old days. Having every single decision I make measured against how Robert Turner would have done it. I stood there. I didn't say anything because I honestly didn't know what to say. I had never once told a client to call me instead of him. I hadn't been to the shop in 3 months. I'm sorry, I finally said, and I meant it, even though I still wasn't sure what exactly I was apologizing for. David rubbed his face with both hands. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, but somehow that made it worse. Look, I love you. You know that. But sometimes, he stopped. Sometimes what? He looked at me for a long moment. Tyler's laughter drifted out from the house behind us. Somewhere inside, Grace was singing something off-key. Sometimes you're a burden, Dad, okay? There, I said it. The garage went very quiet. I want to tell you I had some wise response ready, some calm, fatherly line that put him in his place without raising my voice. I didn't. I just stood there in my son's garage, 74 years old, holding a coffee mug Jennifer had handed me 20 minutes earlier, and I felt something inside my chest simply go still. Okay, I said. That was all. Okay. David seemed to realize almost immediately that he'd gone somewhere he shouldn't have. His face changed. Dad, I didn't mean. It's fine, I said. And I smiled. I actually smiled at him because 41 years of fixing things for people had taught me one lesson above all others. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is not make somebody clean up a mess. They're too tired to see clearly. I finished my coffee. I said goodnight to Jennifer and the kids. I hugged Grace a little longer than usual, and I drove home in the dark, past the shop that still had my name on the old sign out front. Even though David had painted over it years ago, I didn't cry. I want you to know that. I'm not a man who cries easily, and I didn't cry that night either. I just sat in my truck in my own driveway for almost 20 minutes before I could make myself go inside. I didn't call David the next day, or the day after that, not out of anger. I want to be honest with you about that because anger would have been the easy feeling, and what I actually felt was harder to carry than anger. I felt like I'd finally heard something true that I'd been avoiding for 2 years. I felt like maybe I actually had become exactly what he said, an old man hanging around a business that used to be mine, offering advice nobody asked for, showing up places I wasn't wanted, mistaking my presence for help. I spent those 3 days the way I spend most days now. Quiet ones. Monday morning, I fed the birds in Carol's old garden, the one I still keep up even though nobody sees it but me. I fixed a flickering porch light for my neighbor, Ruth Ellis, an 81-year-old widow 2 doors down who still thinks I'm the handiest man in Ohio. I sat with my coffee at the kitchen table and looked at an old photograph of David at 9 years old, standing next to me in front of the very first Turner electric van, grinning so wide you could see the gap where his front tooth had fallen out. That boy used to follow me around job sites all summer, used to beg me to let him hold the wire strippers, used to tell his teachers his dad could fix anything in the whole world. I wondered, sitting there, exactly when that boy had stopped being proud of me and started being embarrassed by me instead. I wondered if it happened all at once, or if it crept in slowly the way most painful things do, until one day it was simply the truth and neither one of us had noticed the moment it became true. Tuesday, I drove out to the cemetery and sat by Carol's headstone for a while, the way I do most weeks. I told her about David. I told her what he'd said. I don't know if she can hear me. Not really, but talking to her stone has always felt better than talking to no one at all. He's not wrong to be tired, I told her. Running that business is hard, I remember. So the wind moved through the maple trees over her grave, and for a moment I let myself imagine she was answering me the way she used to when she was alive. And I came home worn out from a bad day. She always had a way of making the truth easier to hold. Wednesday morning, my phone was quiet. No calls from David, no texts from Jennifer. I told myself that was fine. I told myself a man doesn't need to hear from his son every single day to know he's loved. I told myself a lot of things that week, most of them not entirely true. Around noon, Ruth Ellis knocked on my door, holding a plate of banana bread, the way she does every couple of weeks. "You look tired, Robert," she said. "I'm fine, Ruth." She studied me the way only a woman who's buried her own husband can study a man carrying something heavy. "Family trouble?" I almost lied, then I didn't. My son said something to me. "Sunday." "What did he say?" I looked down at the banana bread. "He said I was a burden." Ruth didn't gasp. She didn't reach for my hand and tell me it wasn't true, the way some people might, just to make me feel better. She just nodded slowly, like she'd heard something like this before in her long life, and said, "Give him time, Robert. Grief and pressure make people say things they don't mean. But you should know, the ones who need you the most are usually the ones who say that." I didn't understand what she meant. Not that day. I understood it 3 days later. It was 11:14 at night on Wednesday when my phone rang. I was in my recliner, half asleep in front of a rerun of some old Western, when the screen lit up. "David," my first thought, "I'm not proud of this, but I promise to tell you the truth." My first thought was, now he calls. I let it ring twice before I answered. "David, Dad." His voice was different than I'd heard it in years. Not tired, not stressed, scared. "Dad, I need your help." I sat up straight in the recliner. 41 years in this business teaches you to recognize real fear in a man's voice. The kind that isn't about pride or ego. The kind that comes from staring at something you genuinely don't know how to fix. "What's wrong? Is everyone okay? Jennifer, the kids, everyone's fine." "It's the business, Dad. I don't even know where to start." "Start anywhere." There was a long pause. I could hear him breathing on the other end, and underneath that, some kind of commotion, voices, maybe a radio. "You remember the hospital job? Mercy General, the East Wing expansion?" I did remember it. It was the biggest contract Turner Electric had ever landed, nearly $800,000. 3 years of steady work, the kind of job that could set a small company up for a decade. David had been so proud when he told me about it 2 years ago, back when he still told me things. "I remember," I said. "The city pulled our permits tonight. All of them. The whole East Wing job is shut down as of tomorrow morning." My stomach dropped the way it used to when I got a call about a job gone wrong back in my own working days. "Why? Failed inspection. A major one. They're saying there's a code violation buried somewhere in the original electrical infrastructure. Something from before we even started this phase. Something in the old wing that connects to everything we've built on top of it. If they're right, it's not just a fix. It could be a full teardown of 6 months of work. Maybe more." "David, slow down." "Who's the inspector?" "Gary Holloway." I actually laughed, though nothing about the situation was funny. Gary Holloway and I had known each other for almost 30 years. I'd trained half the crew who trained him, and the crew that installed the connecting infrastructure back in the original build, David continued, his voice cracking slightly. "That was Franklin Subcontracting, Denny Marsh's outfit." That name hit me harder than anything else he'd said. Denny Marsh had done work for me once years ago before I fired him for cutting corners on a job that could have burned a building down. I never told David the full story. I just told him not to hire Franklin Sub for anything load-bearing or electrical. I guess somewhere along the way that warning had gotten lost. "Dad," David said, and his voice broke fully now, "if I can't get this fixed by Friday, the hospital pulls the contract. If the hospital pulls the contract, the bank calls the business loan. If the bank calls the loan," he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. I understood exactly what came next because I'd spent 4 decades building a business one careful decision at a time. And I knew precisely how fast it could all come apart with one bad one. "I don't know what to do," David said. And for the first time since he was maybe 11 years old, my son sounded exactly like a little boy again. "I've got Holloway breathing down my neck. I've got the hospital's facilities director threatening to sue. I've got 12 guys whose paychecks depend on this job, and Dad, I don't know the old wiring in that building. Nobody left in this company does. Nobody but me, I said quietly. The line went silent for a moment. I wired the original East Wing of Mercy General in 1987, I said, before you were even in kindergarten. I know, David whispered. I know, Dad. That's why I'm calling. I want to be honest with you about something. Sitting there in my recliner at 11:18 at night, hearing my son's voice crack on the other end of the phone, some small, tired, hurt part of me thought about saying no. Not out of cruelty. I've never had cruelty in me. Not really. But there's a difference between forgiveness and forgetting, and 3 days earlier this same man had stood in his garage and called me a burden in front of his own family. I thought about hanging up. I thought about telling him I was sorry, but I was too old to drive out to a job site at midnight, too tired to be needed only when there was no other option. I thought about it for maybe 4 seconds. Then I thought about Tyler and Grace, about 12 men and their families depending on paychecks, about my son's voice sounding like it hadn't sounded since he was small enough to believe his father really could fix anything in the whole world. Give me 20 minutes, I said. I'll meet you at the site. Dad, it's almost midnight. 20 minutes, David. I hung up before he could argue. I got dressed the way I used to get dressed for emergency calls, back when the business was mine. Work boots, flannel shirt, my old tool belt, the one I hadn't touched in 8 years, still hanging on a hook in the garage, exactly where I'd left it the day I handed the keys over to my son. Before I left, I opened the bottom drawer of my desk, the one I keep locked, and pulled out a thick manila folder I hadn't opened in years. Blueprints, hand-drawn wiring schematics, inspection reports from 1987 all the way through the early 90s. Every single job I'd done at Mercy General across more than a decade of work. I don't throw records away. 41 years in this business taught me that the day you think you'll never need something is exactly the day you'll need it most. The drive out to Mercy General took 18 minutes in the dark, empty streets, my headlights cutting through a light fog settling over Grove City. My hands weren't as steady on the wheel as they used to be. My knees ached the way they always do this late at night. But something in me felt more awake than I had in 3 days. I pulled into the hospital's back lot and saw David's truck, along with 2 others I recognized as company vehicles, parked haphazardly near the East Wing construction entrance. Floodlights lit up the site. A handful of men stood around looking exhausted and defeated, the way crews look when they've just been told their work might all be undone. David was standing near the entrance, talking to a man in a city inspector's jacket. I recognized Gary Holloway even from a distance, the way his shoulders always hunched slightly when he was delivering bad news he didn't enjoy giving. David saw me first. For a moment, neither one of us moved. There was so much sitting between us. 3 days of silence, one hard word spoken in a garage, years of small distances neither of us had ever named out loud. Then David walked over, and before I could say anything at all, he wrapped both arms around me and held on the way he hadn't since he was maybe 15 years old. "Dad," he said into my shoulder. I'm so sorry about what I said. We'll talk about that later," I said quietly. "Right now, show me the panel." Gary Holloway recognized me before David even finished the introduction. Bob Turner. He shook his head, almost smiling despite the late hour and the tension hanging over the whole site. "I should have known your name would come up eventually. It usually does." "Gary, been a while. Your boy's in some trouble here." Gary's voice turned serious again. "There's an unpermitted junction buried behind a wall in the original mechanical room. It's old wiring feeding into new load calculations nobody accounted for. If it's what I think it is, we're not talking about a simple fix. We're talking about ripping out drywall across 3 floors to trace it." "Show me," I said. We walked into the old mechanical room together, David a half step behind me the whole way, quiet in a way I wasn't used to. The room smelled the way old hospital infrastructure always smells: dust, metal, faint traces of decades-old insulation. Holloway pointed his flashlight at a section of exposed wall where a newer crew had cut into the original electrical chase. I studied it for a long moment. Then I set my folder down on a nearby table, opened it, and pulled out a hand-drawn schematic, the paper gone soft and yellow with age. "There," I said, pointing at a junction marked in my own handwriting from 37 years earlier. "That's not a violation. That's a redundancy loop I installed on purpose in case the East transformer ever failed during surgery hours. It's grandfathered under the code that existed in 1987. Whoever flagged this as a violation didn't know what they were looking at, because there's no record of it anywhere except this folder, because I never filed a formal amendment. I just built it in and told the hospital's chief engineer at the time. He's been retired 11 years. Gary took the schematic from me carefully, studying it under his flashlight. This is dated, signed, stamped. Every job I ever did was. He looked at me for a long moment, then let out a breath that seemed to release some of the tension he'd been carrying all evening. This changes things considerably, Bob. If this is legitimate, and I have no reason to think it isn't, then the violation isn't in the original infrastructure at all. So what caused tonight's failure? David asked, stepping forward for the first time. I already had a guess. I flipped to another page in my folder, then walked slowly along the wall until I found what I was looking for, a section where the wiring didn't match my original schematic at all. This, I said, tracing my finger along a splice that had clearly been added much more recently, done with materials that hadn't even existed when I built this system. Someone tied new construction into this loop without understanding what it was, and did it with connectors that don't meet code for a hospital environment. This isn't old work failing. This is new work done carelessly on top of old work nobody bothered to understand first. David went very still. Franklin Sub did the connecting work in this section 18 months ago. Denny Marsh's crew, I said. You knew about him, David said quietly. It wasn't a question. I told you years ago not to use his outfit for anything load-bearing or electrical. David closed his eyes. I forgot. Dad, I swear, I just forgot. That was 5 years ago you told me that. Back when I was still learning the business. I didn't even think about it when the bid came in low. I didn't say anything harsh, so there was no point. My son was standing in front of a hospital inspector at nearly 1 in the morning, watching everything he'd built threaten to collapse because of one corner someone else had cut, and he didn't need me piling on. It's fixable, I said instead. The violation isn't structural. It's a bad splice done with the wrong materials in the wrong environment. That's a repair, not a teardown. Gary, if I walk your team through every inch of this original system tomorrow and we redo the connecting work properly, can we save the timeline? Gary looked between the two of us for a long moment. If everything checks out the way this documentation suggests, and if the repair is done right, if I can reinstate the permits by end of week, I'll need full transparency. Every inch. You'll have it, I said. We worked until nearly 4 in the morning that first night. I walked every foot of that old system with David and 2 of his most trusted guys, a good young electrician named Marcus and an older hand named Pete who'd actually worked for me briefly, decades earlier before David was even born. Somewhere around 3 a.m., sitting on an overturned bucket in that dusty mechanical room, drinking coffee from a gas station down the street, David finally asked the question I think had been sitting in his chest the whole night. Why did you come, Dad? After what I said to you. I thought about it for a moment before I answered. I wanted to give him something true, not just something comfortable. Because you're my son, I said, and because 12 men are counting on paychecks that don't care whether you and I are getting along. And because I paused. Because somewhere in all of this, David, I think I understand why you said what you said. He looked at me, surprised. You've spent 8 years trying to prove this business is yours, I said. Not mine anymore. Yours. And every time I showed up, unannounced, offering advice nobody asked for, I wasn't helping you build that. I was reminding everyone, including you, that it used to be mine. I didn't mean to do that, but I think I did it anyway. David's eyes filled and he looked away, out toward the dark hallway beyond the mechanical room. That's not an excuse for what I said, he said quietly. There's no excuse for that. No, I agreed. There isn't, but there's an explanation, and sometimes understanding the explanation matters more than deciding whether it's an excuse. We sat in silence for a while after that. Not an uncomfortable silence. The kind 2 people share when they've said something true and need a minute to let it settle. I've been so scared, Dad, David finally said. This business, the loan, the kids. Sometimes I feel like I'm barely holding on, and every time you showed up, I felt like you could see exactly how close I was to dropping everything. I didn't want you to see that. So I pushed you away instead. You should have just told me that, I said. Instead of calling me a burden. I know. His voice cracked again. I know, Dad. I'm sorry. I've been sorry every single day since Sunday. I just didn't know how to say it. I reached over and put my hand on my son's shoulder, the way I used to when he was small and scared of something in the dark. You said it just now, I told him. That's enough for me. The next 3 days were some of the longest of my life and also, strangely, some of the best. I was back on a job site for the first time in 8 years, not as the boss, not as the old man hanging around, but as exactly what David needed. A man who remembered things nobody else remembered, standing shoulder to shoulder with his son fixing what needed fixing. We worked from early morning until late into the evening each day. David introduced me to his crew differently than he had 2 years earlier at that strip mall. This time, when the younger guys asked who I was, David didn't say used to. He said, "This is my father. He built this company. If you want to actually understand electrical work, watch him." I won't pretend that didn't mean something to me. At 74 years old, I didn't think I had anything left to prove to anyone. Turns out a man's heart doesn't fully retire, even when his hands do. Gary Holloway came by twice to check our progress, and both times he left satisfied, shaking my hand a little longer than strictly necessary. "Your reputation held up this whole business together, Bob," he told me on the second visit. Not many men can say that 7 years later. By Thursday evening, the repair work was done. Every splice replaced with proper hospital-grade materials. Every inch of the connecting infrastructure documented, matched against my original schematics, verified and re-verified. Friday morning, Gary Holloway walked the site one final time, clipboard in hand, David and I standing near the entrance the whole time, neither one of us saying much, both of us holding our breath in our own quiet ways. When Gary finally came back out, he didn't say anything at first. He just looked at David, then at me, and then he smiled. "Permits are reinstated," he said. "Full clearance. You're back on schedule as of Monday." David let out a breath I don't think he'd been holding consciously for 4 days straight. He turned to me, and for a moment I thought he might actually cry right there in front of his whole crew. "We did it," he said. "You did it," I corrected him. "I just remembered some old wiring, Dad." His voice was firm. "Don't do that. Don't make yourself small right now. You saved this company. If you hadn't come Wednesday night, we would have lost everything. The hospital contract, the bank loan, 12 men's jobs, all of it." I didn't argue with him further. Some moments aren't meant for arguing. Some moments are simply meant for standing quietly in the fact of what just happened and letting it be true. That Sunday, dinner at David and Jennifer's looked different than it had the week before. David asked me to come early, before Tyler and Grace got home from a friend's birthday party, before Jennifer finished cooking. He wanted to talk, just the two of us, out on the back porch where we used to sit together when Carol was still alive and the whole family still felt effortless. "I've been thinking all week about what to say to you," David began, sitting across from me with 2 cups of coffee between us. "And I don't think I can say it perfectly, but I want to try anyway." I waited. "What I said to you in the garage," he said, "wasn't really about you at all. I think you already know that. It was about me being terrified I couldn't run this business the way you did. Every time you showed up, I saw everything I was scared I wasn't measuring up to. And instead of telling you that, I made you feel like you weren't wanted. That's on me. It's not on you. Not ever on you." "David, let me finish," he said gently. "Please." I nodded. "You spent 41 years building something so I could have an easier start than you did. You never once made me feel like I owed you for that. Not once in 8 years did you ever say, 'I gave you this business.' You just quietly kept giving, over and over, even after I stopped noticing, even after I started treating you like you were in the way, instead of like you were the reason any of this exists at all." His voice caught, and he looked down at his coffee for a moment before continuing. "Wednesday night, when I called you, I honestly didn't know if you'd come. I wouldn't have blamed you if you hadn't. But you got dressed at 11 o'clock at night, and you drove out to that hospital, and you saved everything I've worked for 3 days after I called you a burden to your face. I don't know how to ever make that right, Dad. I don't know if I can." I let the silence sit for a moment before I answered him. "You already are making it right," I said. "Right now, this conversation. This is how you make it right, not with some grand gesture, just with the truth, spoken plainly man to man. David wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, something I hadn't seen him do since he was a boy. I want you back at the shop, he said. Not checking up on me, not looking over my shoulder. I mean really back. Consulting on the big jobs, training the new guys, being Robert Turner again in front of everyone, not some old-timer nobody bothered to introduce properly. If you'll have me as a business partner instead of just a son who forgot how much he owes you. I thought about that for a long moment. 8 years ago, I'd handed him the keys because I wanted him to have something entirely his own. Some part of me worried that going back now would undo that, would make him feel small again in his own company. But looking at my son's face on that porch, I understood something I hadn't fully understood before. David didn't need me gone to feel like the business was his. He needed to know I was proud of him, whether I was standing beside him or 3 towns away. The distance had never been the thing keeping his confidence safe. It had only been keeping us apart. So, I'd like that, I said. On one condition, anything. You stop calling me the old-timer. I built that company with these 2 hands before you could walk. I've earned the right to still be called Bob Turner, master electrician, not somebody's relic. David laughed, a real laugh, the kind I hadn't heard from him in longer than I wanted to admit. Deal. 6 months have passed since that night at Mercy General. Turner Electric finished the East Wing expansion 3 weeks ahead of the adjusted schedule. The hospital's facilities director was so impressed with how the crisis was handled that she personally recommended the company for 2 additional contracts, one of them the largest in the company's history. I go into the shop 3 days a week now, not as the boss. David still runs everything, the bids, the scheduling, the client relationships he's built entirely on his own over 8 years. But I train the young guys on the fundamentals, the kind of careful, honest work that keeps buildings standing and families safe, the kind of work you can't learn from a manual, only from someone who's spent a lifetime doing it right. Marcus, the young electrician who worked alongside us that first long night, calls me coach now. Half joking, though I notice he takes notes every single time I explain something. Pete, the older hand who briefly worked for me decades ago, brings me coffee every morning like it's still 1995. Sunday dinners are different too. Better, if I'm honest. Tyler asks me real questions now about the business, about wiring, about the years before he was born when his grandfather and his father built something out of nothing together. Grace still sings off-key in the kitchen, and I still pretend not to notice how much it sounds exactly like her grandmother used to sound. Last month, David called me into his office at the shop. On the wall behind his desk, where a generic motivational poster used to hang, there was something new. My original 1987 wiring schematic for Mercy General's East Wing, the one that saved the entire hospital contract, framed and hung with a small brass plate underneath it. The plate read, "Built right the first time. Robert Turner, master electrician, 1987, and still teaching us how, today." I stood there for a long moment, looking at it, and David stood beside me, not saying anything, letting the silence carry what words might have made smaller. "I should have hung something like this 8 years ago," he finally said. "You hung it now," I told him. "That's what matters." I think about that Sunday night in the garage sometimes, the word he used, to the way it landed in my chest like something breaking. I won't pretend it didn't hurt. Some hurts don't disappear just because they get resolved. They just become part of the story you carry, a reminder of how close we can come to losing the people who matter most, simply by forgetting to say what we actually mean. But I also think about 11:14 on a Wednesday night, my phone lighting up in the dark, my son's voice cracking on the other end, needing me the way he hadn't needed me in years. I think about how fast everything can change, how quickly a man can go from being called a burden to being the only one who can save everything that matters. I don't say any of this to make David feel guilty. He carries enough of that on his own, and I've told him more than once that guilt only helps a man if he lets it teach him something, instead of just punishing him with it. He's learned the lesson. I've watched him become a better son, a better father to his own children, a more patient boss to the young men who work under him, all because of one hard week in early spring. If there's one thing I've learned in 74 years, it's this. Family isn't measured by the words we say on our best days. It's measured by what we do on our worst ones, the nights we get out of bed, drive through the dark, and show up anyway, even when we have every reason not to. My son called me a burden on a Sunday evening in his garage. 3 days later, at nearly midnight, he called me his last hope. I chose to believe the second one was truer than the first. I think in the end, that choice is what saved us both. If you've ever felt overlooked by the people you gave everything to, I hope this reminds you that your worth was never measured by whether they noticed it in time. It was always there, quietly holding everything together long before anyone said thank you. Has someone in your own family ever needed you most, right after making you feel like they didn't need you at all? I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. If this story reminded you how much quiet love a parent can carry, even when it goes unnoticed, consider leaving a like so more people can find stories like this one. And if you know someone who's ever felt like a burden to the people they love the most, send this to them. Sometimes the people who carry us the longest are the ones we forget to carry back. We believe stories about family, forgiveness, and quiet strength deserve to be told and remembered. If stories like this one matter to you, we'd be honored to have you join us again. Thank you for spending this time with me today. Take care of the people who show up for you at midnight. And if you can, be the kind of person who shows up too.